is that we're going to start here in Amudei Hod on page Chav Vav, and we stopped at Os Vav, and we're talking about the Tosfos Rabenu Peretz, and the issue here on the table is Heseiba for Afikoman, and the question is Lama Tzarich L'Aseh Pamayim. At the time that he ate the first Kazayis Matzah, at the beginning of the Seder, he already fulfilled his mitzvah of Heseiba. Why does he need another Heseiba at the time of Achilas Afikoman? Tosfos gives an answer that we have a suffix. We don't know which of the two Kizesim is the Ikar, is the Kiyum of Achilas Matzah. And it could be that it's actually the second Kizais that we eat at the end of the meal, Ala Sova, which is called the Afikoman. That's the Ikar mitzvah. But we make the bracha at the beginning of the Seder for a technical reason, which is called Liacha Shamila Kreso Mehan. And the Tosfos Rabenu Peretz cannot afford, he cannot have the luxury of accepting this Tosfos. The answer to Tosfos is predicated on the premise that there's a suffix which matzah you're yotze. But Tosfos Rabenu Peretz later on Daf Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis, which you're going to see in a minute what he writes, he disagrees with Tosfos, and he holds that we don't have any suffix whatsoever. We know exactly which Kizayis is the Kiyum mitzvah. And therefore, the Tosfos Rabenu Peretz is compelled to come up with his own answer to the question why we need Heseiba on the Afikoman. So now let's take a look at Tosfos Rabenu Peretz later on Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis, and we try to get an insight as to why he cannot accept Tosfos, namely that we don't know which Kizayis is the Kizayis Shel Mitzvah. Ein potrin achar Pesach Afikoman Pirush. Afiku minei targimu shelo levatel tam matzah umar. He says the following, that when the Gemara tells us that we should not eat any sort of sweets, any desserts after the matzah, because we shouldn't be mevatel the tam matzah, that's a reference to the Afikoman. Umatzah achrona hi ikar. So the Gemara is assuming that the last matzah, meaning the Afikoman, which he eats when he's satiated, that's the Ikar matzah. And therefore, we have to be very careful. The Gemara establishes not to eat anything after the matzah b'achrona, after the Afikoman, that would be mevatel the tam matzah. V'tema. Tosfos Rabenu Peretz doesn't understand. If you're telling me that the Afikoman comes under the halacha of alasova and tam matzah b'fiv, that means that that's the Ikar mitzvah. Lama anu mevarchim al rishona. So then why do we eat the first kizayis and recite a bracha shekichanu mitzvos v'tzivano on that first matzah? We should really livarech, make the bracha al achrono shehi ha'ikar. So again, we're going to have one answer of Tosfos to this question, and that is that we make the bracha on the first matzah for a technical reason, which I referred to before as lachar shamila kreisamihem. But Rabenu Peretz doesn't like that answer. For whatever reason, he wants to come up with a different answer. Nirali de mishum de vivemayu ochlin matzah shira al sudaso. Guess what says Tosfos Rabenu Peretz? They didn't make the bracha before the first matzah. They only made the bracha on the last matzah. That was their minute. We'll see how that changed and why it changed. But the original old tradition was to recite the bracha before the last matzah, which is eaten ala sova, and that's the Ikar mitzvah. In fact, he goes as far as to say that the first matzah that they ate at the beginning of the Seder to be kovei suda, that was matzah shira. It had a mixture of fruit juices, and it could not possibly serve as lechem oni for the mitzvah matzah. and it was only there to be koveh seuda. So there's no doubt that if they started the Suda with matzah shira, today you'll see sometimes in the grocery stores, in the supermarkets, you'll see grape matzahs. I don't know if you see it here in Israel as much as in America. Have you seen it? Grape matzahs made out of grape juice with grape juice. Usually they have a little a tzetel. They have a note on the side of the box of the matzahs. They said this is for only for older people, and so forth and so on. But it's matzah shira. That's what they ate at the time of the Gemara for the first matzah shira, just to be koveh the Suda. But it was not possible to fulfill the mitzvah or to make a bracha on that matzah. So when did they make the bracha on the matzah? When was it real matzah lechem oni? That was at the end of the Suda al Sova, what we call the Afikoman. And that was the Iker matzah. The Ozvayim V'Vorchim. Aval Anu. Our minig is different. The Lo Achlina matzah shir. We don't eat matzah shir at the beginning of the meal. Ein levarech al achrona. The reason why we don't make the bracha on the achrona. So he invokes the principle of Tosas liachar shemila kreisamehan. We cannot make a bracha on the matzah b'achrona because we've already eaten the matzah b'rishona. So call it a ma'aseh mitzvah, ma'aseh b'achila. And on that we make the bracha, even though the real matzah, the kiyuma mitzvah, is going to come at the end of the meal al hasova. V'yem tovim v'navid hachin v'arach achrona. Yeshlomo lefi she'enon u'zehirin kamosam shlo lechol matzah achilas gasa v'lachein anu mevarchan aleh tchila. He says, Tos Rabenu Peretz, why can't we continue the original tradition, the original minhag, and delay the bracha until the matzah b'achrona? So first he had said, Ein levarach al achrona le'achar shemila kreisamehan. But now he's asking, well, why did the minhag change? Why not continue the original minhag, Hamotzi lech menartz, meaning be koveh suda on matzah shira, and wait until the end of the meal, and after the meal, al hasova, and then make the bracha on achilus matzah and eat lechem oni. And the answer is because they were more careful than we are. We're afraid that lest he fills up his belly on the meal, right? It's a great meal, roast chicken, and there's borscht, and there's soup, and if you eat gebrachts with knedlach, and you fill up your whole meal, and then they bring up who knows what desserts. And the Balas Abayis is so proud of all her new Pesach recipes. And now you're really stuffed to the gill. And if you're going to eat the matzah now, l'shem mitzvah, that's called an achila gasa. The mitzvah was meant to be fulfilled al hasova, not achila gasa. Al hasova means when he still has some room in his stomach to fill up. But once he's already filled to capacity, the achila subsequent to that point is called an achila gasa. And that completely undermines the mitzvah. So therefore, we want to guarantee that under all circumstances he fulfills his mitzvah matzah. We're going to require that he eat the matzah at the beginning of the meal with a bracha, so that if, heaven forbid, he gets the Afikoman when he's so full that it becomes an achila gasa, he does not forfeit the mitzvah of matzah because he ate the matzah at the beginning of the meal. And that matzah is going to be matzah of lechem oni that's royal in mitzvahs. So back at the time of the Gemara, when they were more careful, we didn't have to worry about achila gasa. They would recite the bracha at the end of the meal, al hasova, on the mitzvah of matzah. The original achila at the beginning of the meal was matzah shira, and there was no bracha asher kidshan mitzvah, just hamotzi lechem. But now that we have this new chashash, that lest he eat the matzah b'achrona an achila gasa, which would completely negate his mitzvah, we want to make sure that he has the mitzvah of achilas matzah in any event, and to guarantee that we're going to eat the matzah at the beginning of the meal with a bracha, knowing full well that if we follow the rules and we don't exaggerate in the achila, we will get to the Afikoman, and that will be our kiyum achilas matzah. We'll eat it ala sova, but not chas v'shalom achila gasa. But since in our time we're not as careful, we eat the meal as if there was no tomorrow, and we get so stuffed that the achila might be an achila gasa, which would negate and undermine the mitzvah. Therefore, to guarantee that we have the mitzvah in our back pocket, we eat the matzah barishona at the beginning of the meal with a bracha. And it's not lechamoni. I mean, it's not matzah shir, it's lechamoni. So he says in some that we see from Rabenu Peretz that at the time of the Gemara, the mitzvah of achilas matzah was fulfilled at the end with the Afikoman, and that's when they made the bracha. What they ate before that was not matzah or mitzvah, it was matzah shir, bizman hazeh. And that's what we said before, we're makayim the mitzvah with the kazayis rishon. Okay. Now let's understand why we need Heseiba, according to Rabenu Peretz, for both the original Kizayis and the last Kizayis. And without even reading number Zayin, which will take us over to page Chav Zayin in a minute, we could already anticipate the answer to the question. Bisman Gemara, they only had a save on the last matzah because that was lechamoni, l'shem mitzvah, ala sova, and that's when they made the bracha on matzah. There was no requirement to have save on the first matzah because that was lechem matzah shira, which was not lemitzvah. Bisman hazeh, we're going to have a save on both kizayis, both achilas matzah. The first one, because we're going to be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah to guarantee that we don't mess up with an achila gas at the end of the meal. And that requires a savor, because that's the mitzvah of matzah. That's when we're making the bracha asher kitzon mitzvah. On the other hand, if we follow the rules and fulfill the mitzvah in its ideal way, and that means that matzah should be nechal ala sova, but not achila gasa, then when we get to the last matzah, the Afikoman, that's when we have kavana to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. So we get the additional kiyum of ala sova. The mela, we need a seva because that's the ikar matzah. So although the minig has the ikar matzah barishona, and therefore requires seva, but in truth, going below the surface of the minig, digging deeper, the real matzah is the last matzah. And that's what we eat ala sova. That would require a seva. But let's see if we're on the right track. So again, just to look at number Zayin at the time of the Gemara, they did a seva. Only at the time of Achilas Afikoman, the first matzah was matzah shira. It was not l'shem mitzvah, and it didn't require a seva. Now, in our time, we really have two mitzvahs. He says the first mitzvah, which is the mitzvah d'oraisa b'erev tofu matzahs, will fulfill at the time of the bracha, at the beginning of the meal. That's the matzah rishona. But now we have an issue of ala sova, which means that we complete our meal with matzah, and the time of the matzah remains in our mouth. That cannot be fulfilled with the kazayis rishona. So with all due respect to our minhag, that we're going to eat a kazayis matzah of lechem oni l'shem mitzvah with a bracha at the beginning of the meal. Nevertheless, in doing so, we forfeited that special kiyum of ala sova and she ate matzah b'fiv, which she can only fulfill at the end of the meal with the Afikoman. Now he calls that a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. I'm not exactly sure about that, but that's what he said. Sfirle Rabenu Peretz, shekol achilos hamatzah, all the achilos hamatzah that we need to eat, shehem mitzvah, we're required to eat those matzahs, the first and the last. Tzarech lahasavem, shetiknu chacham lahasav be eis achilas mitzvah. Whenever you're fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah, you need Heseiba. When are you fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah? Well, that's a complex question with a complex answer, which is both matzahs. You need both matzahs to fulfill the perfect shleimus of the mitzvah of matzah. The Afikoman Gamhu, moving on to page Chav Zayin, Achilas mitzvah, because it's ala sova and it's ta matzah b'fiv, and therefore tzarech lahasibo, it is a mitzvah. Now again, I admit to you, I don't understand right now why he calls it a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. In my mind, it's a mitzvah d'Oraisa, but it's possible, but we have to know more about Arei Psachim, that the halacha of alasova is a cloned halacha that's taken from the Korban Pesach. If we didn't have Korban Pesach, there'd be no halacha of Tam B'Fiv. Tam B'Fiv and alasova is a special halacha in the Kodshim of Korban Pesach. The last kizayis, or let's put it this way, the mitzvah of matzah, will be a replacement for the Korban Pesach. Maybe that's what he has in mind. But that's only in the Rabbanan. But we require tam matzah b'fiv. That's a halacha that was projected from the Korban Pesach onto matzah. Now that we don't have the Korban Pesach, we take that element of the mitzvah of achilas HaPesach, namely alasova, and we clone it or project it onto matzah. That's the Rabbanan. But nevertheless, since the kiyum of matzah, bachrona, alasova, with tam matzah b'fiv, therefore we require a sefer. Now he has a very interesting insight here in the next part here. It's about 10 lines long in brackets. It starts on the top line, it ends about 8, 9 lines down. So if I understand correctly, and I say this with limited liability, I think what he's driving at is that when you drink the kosos and you require a seibo, why isn't it enough to do a seibo with one kos? You've already fulfilled your mitzvah of a seibo. And yet, the Gemara insists that the barest minimum in Daled kosos of the Heseiba requirement is 2 kosos, whether it's the first 2 or the last 2, but it's always the number 2. Why 2? It's a repetition of the same mitzvah of Heseiba, which you've already implemented on the first kos. 1 or 3, whatever kos it is, but single out 1 kos, do Heseiba on 1 kos. Why is the barest minimum 2 kosos? And the answer has to be that Chazal were misaken a concept called achila shel mitzvah. whenever you have achila shel mitzvah, or in this case in Daled Kosos Shesia shel mitzvah, the mitzvah generates a chiyuv heseiba. That mitzvah of the night of Pesach, which is an integral part of Sipitzis Mitzrayim, requires heseiba. Why 2 and not 4? My dava hava, or the Iker Cheres is the last 2, whatever svar you'll come up with. But we still see that the achila shel mitzvah generates a chiyuv heseiba. And Rabenu Peretz is going to make an analogy here, derive a conclusion that if an achila shel mitzvah requires a heseiba, then the Afikoman, insofar as it's a mitzvah that he classifies as the Rabbanon of Tam Matzah B'Fiv, Bachrona, Alasov, etc., that requires a heseiba. Once you've defined it as an achila shel mitzvah, then the first heseiba of matzah is not enough. He needs another heseiba for the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of matzah b'achrona ala sova the Afikoman. However, Rabenu Peretz is in a bind, because with regard to Daled Kosos, we only require a heseiba on the first 2 kosos and not the last 2 kosos, because my dahava hava. And we could equally apply my dahava hava to the case of the 2 achilos of matzah. You've already eaten the first matzah at the culmination of Sipitzis Mitzrayim with heseiba. So you've already fulfilled your mitzvah heseiba in the first matzah. Why do you need heseiba in the last matzah of Afikoman? You'll tell me because it's an achila shel mitzvah. Yeah, but what about the second set of Daled Kosos? That's also shtia shel mitzvah. And for desveged, even though it is, nevertheless we exonerate him of the mitzvah of heseiba because of my dahava hava. And that logic should apply to the Afikoman as well. So the achila shel mitzvah svara that we derive from Daled Kosos, because 2 kosos and not less than 2 require a heseiba, means that those 2 kosos form some sort of an entity called a Shesia shel mitzvah. And the Shesia shel mitzvah is an integration of 2 kosos. In the case of matzah, according to Rabenu Peretz, each matzah, each kazayis matzah that he eats parallels one of the 2 sets of the Daled Kosos. So although the set of Daled Kosos minimally is 2 kosos, in matzah it's only 1 matzah. And when you get to the last matzah, you've basically gotten to the last of the 4 kosos, meaning the second set of 2 kosos, which do not require a heseiba. So although an achila shel mitzvah generates a chiyuv heseiba, but once you fulfilled that mitzvah heseiba, you're exempt. And that's why the second set of kosos did not require a heseiba according to this man Yoma. On a conceptual level, you could say, when I say conceptual, I mean just in terms of pure definitions without any compelling logic, that there is one mitzvah of 4 kosos. We've discussed this at great length in the past. If there's one mitzvah Daled Kosos, then it makes sense that I apply the principle of my dahava hava. And if I drank 2 out of the 4 kosos by heseiba, I don't need a heseiba for the last 2 kosos. Why? Because the last 2 kosos is also part of one entity and one mitzvah called Daled Kosos. But in the case of matzah, each matzah has its own kiyum to it. The fulfillment of the mitzvah of matzah breaks down into 2. Kasher, the first kiyum of matzah is just simply the mechanical act of achila. The second kiyum of matzah is achila la sova with hamatzah befit. So therefore, you need Heseiba on both achilas matzah. It's not like the case of kosos, where we say you don't need Heseiba on the second set of kosos, 3 and 4, because you've already been Mekayim the Shasiyah Shal Mitzvah with the first 2. That's because all 4 kosos are integrated into one whole. And is one identical kiyum, which is accomplished by all 4 kosos together as one entity. If that entity as an entity already has Heseiba attached to it, like pin the tail on the donkey kind of thing, so you've already attached Heseiba to that entity called Daled Kosos, albeit with the first 2 kosos, there's no need to repeat the Heseiba on the last 2 kosos. But that's not the same in matzah, because although Daled Kosos form one indivisible kiyum, made up of 4 shtiyos, but it's one kiyum. In the case of matzah, we have 2 different kiyumim, 2 different mitzvahs. So let's see if we could fit that into the language of Peretz in Os Ches. V'alkach tirei Rabenu Peretz the b'matzah ikach chiyu b'fnei asma shel Heseiba af de kvar avra hacherus ma'ida v'hav. O mishum shematzah hi ikar hasuuda v'lachein tzorch v'haros b'acherus o mishum shikar hacherus never b'matzah. I don't know. He definitely doesn't say what I say. That's for sure. But what does he say? He gives 3 different possibilities. He says either the principle of Ma'ida V'Hava doesn't apply to matzah, maybe he means because cherus is integral to the matzah, meaning forget about dibur and sipur, bepeh. Let's talk about the ma'isa beguf of achilas matzah. That mice itself is essentially cherus, shlo hispik b'tzekom lahachmitz, and therefore it always requires a Heseiba. Then he gives the second answer of Ikar Sa'uda, which I think is just another variation of the first answer. The first answer is based on Shlo Hispik B'Tzekom. The second is based on the Suda. We discussed this at great length, that the Suda is an integral part of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. And therefore it requires Hafganas, a demonstration of Cherus, which is through Heseiba. The third answer is that Ikar Cherus Nemer B'Matzah, but that's the way we interpreted the first answer. So I don't know the difference between his first answer and his third answer. I don't know, unless you see it. I don't see it. Now he quotes the Agos Maimonios. Motzasi kosuv shetzorich lasos Heseiba v'kezayis achilas rishona yishvarach al achilas matz v'gam v'achilas Afikoman titravayu l'shem mitzvah ochel. See, I wanted to say travayu l'shem mitzvah shonos ochel, meaning 2 different kiyumin. I don't think that's what he's saying. Mashe mesiv gam b'yeis achilas kazayis rishon v'gam b'yeis achilas Afikoman. Ain't no misafek. It's not like Tosus Shita that's misafek. We don't know which is the Ikar Matzah. Ela mishum de travayu achilos mitzvah. V'tiknu lahasiv v'eis achilos ha-mitzvah. But again, the question arises, why don't you say my da'ava? Okay, it's both matzah, berishon and matzah b'achron is achilas mitzvah, but within the framework of achilas mitzvah, all I need is one Heseiba, which I already fulfilled with the first matzah. V'hine legufa kusha madua tzarich lahasiv afikoman rei hashle kvar havya cheres v'gam kvar hesiv v'kazayis rishon. So I think what he's saying is that he already completed the Sipri Yetzias Mitzrayim way before he gets to the Afikoman. And as far as the mitzvah of Heseiba, that he fulfilled with the first Kazayas, so why does he need another Heseiba on the last Kazayas? V'chai gavna le'lishna de mesiv bebeis kos rishonos eno mesiv bebeis achronos mishum shekvar hesiv ukvar havya cheres u'may davahava. Ishlomar the dafka be'inyan hakosos shebeshtei hakos rishonos hesiv bizman matim b'shah shemaskil lacheres lo tiknu heseiv bizman achav v'matzah shetiknu lahasiv because rishon afapi shekvar havya cheres yishum de'ein lanu zman matim b'shalo b'tchila la b'cheres. It's the kinu shil chomatza b'seiba mikol. What's he saying here? I don't know. I'm just gonna take a minute here to change this thing. Well, let's see if we can figure out what he's saying here. We're in Os test now. And we're up to Yesh Makom Lomar, which is about line 7. The Dafka Ve'inyan Hakosos, there we're going to say that it's enough that he did Heseiba on the first 2 Kosos. Shebeshtei HaKos Rishonos Hesiv, and that's Kishemaschila Cheres. Avo B'matzah, so it's not matchila lacheres. Mishum the ein lanu zman matim shalom matchila lacheres sheyochal b'matzah. So far I understood, but then it gets confusing to me that the time for Achilas Matzah does not coincide with the Zman of Maschil Lacheres, because after all, he's already completed Magi. But then he says something with a double negative here, which I don't understand. Mishum she'en lanu zman matim shalom maschil lacheres sheyochal b'matzah. So again, he says, Mishum she'ein lanu zman matim, which I thought means that we don't have a possibility of integrating the achilas matzah into the fabric of Sipri Tzis Mitzrayim of Magid, of Tchilul Acheres. That I understand. The matzah has to come later. Now, what's the next phrase? Shalom Maschila Loch Cheres Sheyochal Bo Matzah. That's a double negative here. Ein lanu zman matim shalom maschila loch cheres sheyochal bo matzah. I'm going to sort of overlook the language problem that I have here. I'm just going to assume that there's no time period that we can define and classify as maschila loch cheres, which is royal achilas matzah, is therefore tiknu sheyochal matzah Heseiba mikol makom. So in the case of Daled Kosos, where at least with regard to the first two Kosos, we coincide with a time period that's called Maschila Lacheres. Therefore, we can apply the principle of my Dahaba Hava, and you don't need Heseiba for the second two Kosos, because that's beyond Cheres. But in the case of Matzah, where the Matzah doesn't coincide at all with Maschila Lacheres, they made a takana that every achilas matzah should require Heseiba. The Islam came with the hutzruchu l'saken Heseiba v'matzah. Afal pisha eno zman mat'u. No, it doesn't coincide with matchilu lacheres. He's already completed the story of cheres. It's tiknu kain b'chol achilas ha-mitzvah shel matzah v'tzarich lahasid gam b'achilas Afikoman. Oh, okay. So I think we're on the right track here. He's saying that when the mitzvah is the achilo, in this case the shtiyah is connected to and coincides with cherus, then we can apply the principle that the Heseiba will be fulfilled b'tchilas hacherus and not later on with the second set of kosa. But when the mitzvah of achila is not connected at all to cherus, for example, in the case of matzah, which is not connected to cherus because he only eats the matzah after he's completed cherus, then the takana was that every achila shel mitzvah requires Heseiba. So the two different takanas here of Heseiba. There's one takana of Heseiba that is connected to and generated by maskila zmana maskila cherus, and that patters you up from Heseiba in the second set of kosos. And then there's a different takana which is not connected to zman of haskolas hacherus, because in the case of matzah, by definition, it's after cherus, and that is achila shel mitzvah. Once it's the definition of achila shel mitzvah, that's what generates the chiyuv Heseiba. It's going to apply to every achila shel mitzvah, whether it be the first gezayis of matzah or the Afikoman at the end of the soup. He says, although this seems to be the answer to the question of Rabenu Peretz, it doesn't fit into the language of Rabenu Peretz. Shrei hiksha lama mesid bizman achilas Afikoman, v'ayna mishum shafal pi shehutzuchu l'saken sheyesev b'eis kezayis rishon afal pi she'eno zman hamatim. He's already finished the Magid. Lo aminan shehutra haritzua In other words, Rabenu Peretz himself is not willing to accept the second definition that every achilas mitzvah requires Heseiba. He still maintains that once you fulfilled Heseiba in that mitzvah, then you don't need another Heseiba. So once you implemented Heseiba on the first kezayis of matzah, and that was the takana, then you're not going to require a second Heseiba on the second achilas matzah. Again, he's saying that even though the takana of Heseiba and matzah is not connected to the Zman HaMiyuchad L'Heseiba, meaning the Zman of Tchilas Acherus, because it's after Magid, but nevertheless, all they require is one Heseiba. And according to Tosar Rabenu Peretz, to the same extent that they alleviated us of Heseiba in the second set of Daled Kosos, we are convinced that they should alleviate us of Heseiba on the second Achilus Mat. You see, what bothers me here is, what is the final answer of Rabenu Peretz? I'm just turning back for a moment to page Chaf Hey. He says, "Aval le'inyan matzah." This is in number Daled. Leka chiluk bein betchila k'shor achilus matzah bein besok shel Afikoman u'li'olam tzarich Heseiba. Mishum de'ikar ha'seuda avi min ha'matzah ve'od de'ikar ha'cheres avi min ha'matzah ve'yofu. So, what is the answer of Rabenu Peretz? The ikar haseuda havim min hamatzah. So again, we require a Heseiba twice, but both achilas matzah, mishum de ikar seuda havi min hamatzah. Hinami ikar cheres havi min hamatzah. I guess he's saying, well, I also have another. I'm going back to what I said before, but I don't have another option. That the Suda is integrated into Sipri Tis Mitzrayim, and if the matzah is the Ikar Suda, then it requires Heseiba in order to achieve Sipri Tis Mitzrayim. So we integrate the matzah into the Su'uda as a Su'uda of Sipri Tis Mitzrayim through Heseiba. Heseiba becomes the mechanism by which we impact on the personality, on the nature and the character of the Achilas Matzah in a way that allows us to integrate the Matzah into a Su'uda of Sipri Yitzis Mitzrayim. And the key of keys here, the agent which will achieve that goal, is Heseiba. And furthermore, whenever we eat a matzah l'shem mitzvah, we are demonstrating cherus, and therefore it's appropriate to add the requirement of Heseiba. Now on page Chav Ches, he offers an overview. He starts with the Rambam. The Rambam only requires Heseiba when he eats the Kezayis Rishon. So let's take a look at the Rambam inside. Perek Zayin Halacha Ches. The Emasai Tzrichim Heseiba, B'shas Achilas Kezayis Matzah. Now, there's only one Kezayis that requires Heseiba. Ubishtias Arba Kosos Ha'elu. Shar Achilosu Shtiosu Heseiba Reis and Meshubach Im Lav Eino Tzorich. So that's the Rambam. Again, when he says here, "Rak be'es achilas matzah kezayis matzah rishon," he means lafuki afikoman. The Rambam does not require Heseiba during the Afikoman. L'das Rashi v'Rashbam. Gam bisman hazeh mekayim mitzvos matzah b'achilas kezayis afikoman. Posh tzorich la'osim gam rak bisman achilas kezayis afikoman. Oh. All right, so we didn't get to this sugya yet, but there are Rishonim who maintain that even today, the Iker mitzvah of matzah is the Afikoman. And the first matzah is eaten because of a different reason, of li'achar shavila kresoman. And therefore, it's the second matzah at the end of the meal, the Afikoman, that requires Heseiba. Tosa says that you need Heseiba both at the time of the Kezayis Rishon and at the time of the Afikoman. And that's based on the fact that we don't know which Achila, the first or the second, fulfills the mitzvah of matzah. We don't know. It's a suffix. So we require Heseiba in both. Then we get to Rabenu Peretz. And you need both Heseibos of the first and the last matzah, like Tosfos, but not based on suffix, because Rabenu Peretz rejects the whole concept of suffix. V'taimo, the Kezayis Rishon Mekayim Mitzvos Matzah, the Kezayis Achron Mekayim Mitzvah Afikoman, v'chol achila shehi achilas mitzvah takinu sheyesid bo. Every achilas mitzvah generates a chiv Heseiba. Utravayu l'shem mitzvah ochel. And why don't we apply that same rule to the Daled Kosos? So we tried to suggest, because the Daled Kosos form one entity, whereas the two achilos of matzah are two different mitzvahs. But again, we had that other Rabenu Peretz that said that the reason why you need Heseiba on each achilas matzah is because the Iker Seuda is b'matzah, or that matzah is inherently cheres. For some reason, I'm not sure why, here at this point, he's not presenting that view. He adds in over hey that according to Rabenu Peretz, in our time, we're not going to eat the first Kizayis as matzah shira that they did at the time of the Gemara. We eat matzah shel lechamoni twice, once at the beginning of the meal and once at the end of the meal. And the reason for that is because we're afraid of achila gas. Oh, now he gets to number 5, and he quotes the Gra. Now, I don't think we've seen this before. If we have, I long forgot it. Hatam shetzorach lasim gam b'afikoman v'yochlu b'Heseiba af ledas harosh desvila demekayim mitzvahs matzah b'achilas kizayis rishon. Nevertheless, tzorach lechal afikoman b'Heseiba. Kevan shebizman habayis hoya ikar achilasa. Right, the Torah says al matzahs u'merorim yochluhu, that we eat the korban pesach together with matzah, and that's at the end of the meal because the korban pesach has to be eaten al asova. So bizman hamigdash, they would eat the ikar achilas matzah bachron at the end of the meal together with the korban pesach, and obviously they would require heseiba. So what's he saying here? Nira derotza lomar, ibizman habayis hayikar achilas matzah b'kzayis achron sheyochel and pesach she'nechal b'sof. Okay, so far we're doing good. Today she'nechal asova. V'az hayimeisa b'achilas osa kzayis matzah at the end of his meal. V'alkein anu mesivin v'eis achilas afikoman. So our Heseiba at the time of the Afikoman is to duplicate what they did at the time of the Mikdash, because at that time when the Pesach was eaten al hasova and the matzah was eaten with the Pesach al hasova, they had Heseiba at the time of the matzah b'achrona. Sarah Afikoman replaces that. I think we came up this far on our own without knowing that it's the Vilna Gaon. The Nirami Divrei Agra, the Sfirle Dafikoman Avi Zeichel Matzah. Okay, that's good. I'm happy with that. But tzarich iyah darash atzmo kosa b'simon lamidal dafikomen avi zeichel pesach atzmo. Oh, I see. What exactly is the nature of afikomen? What is it replacing? Is it a duplication of the matzah that was eaten at the end of the Seder Bisman HaMikdash, or of the korban pesach that was eaten at the end of the Mikdash? And here we see a discrepancy between the Gon and the Rosh. The Rosh holds that the Afikoman is like eating the korban pesach, and the Gra holds that the Afikoman is like eating the matzah that accompanied the korban pesach. Now, honestly, I'm not sure why we would make such a big deal about this. It seems like splitting hairs. It's such a subtle difference. Oh, I see. He's worried about the fact that the Rosh is committed to the following position. When they ate the korban pesach, the achilas ha-pesach itself does not require heseiba. We're not sure why. But he does quote poskim who say that the achilas ha-pesach requires heseiba. He says, "Lefi ze yesh lomar da'atam ditzarech lahasiv b'yeis achilas afikoman mishum shu zeichel lePesach." So it's either zeichel lePesach, and the Pesach itself required a seiba, or if the Pesach did not require a seiba, it's zeichel to the matzah that accompanied the korban Pesach, which was the ikar kiyum of matzah, and therefore requires a seiba. Fine. You know what I find about the Amudei Hod, it bothers me when he puts so many things into brackets, Like half the book is in brackets. I'm exaggerating, but sometimes his brackets take up more of the paragraph than that which is outside brackets. You don't know, to what extent does he want you to skip the bracket? But the thrust of what he's saying is that if you hold that the Pesach itself does not require a Heseiba, like for example, the Rambam doesn't mention a word about a Heseiba when he talks about Achilas HaPesach. So it's a little bit odd that if you maintain that the Afikoman is Zeichel Pesach, that it would require a Heseiba. He has these two principles, and he thinks that we accept both of them, and yet they're mutually exclusive. One principle is that the Korban Pesach itself did not require a Heseiba. Another principle is that our Afikoman is Zeichel Pesach. And if you take A and B, you're really stuck, because you'll never be able to justify why the Afikoman requires a Heseiba, insofar as the Afikoman is a replacement of the Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach itself did not require a Heseiba. That's the thrust of what he's juggling here. Now we're up to Simon Hay. You have Simon Hay, right? Just if you could confirm that you have Simon Hay, that's on page Chavtes. Knock, knock. Steve, you have Simon Hay or not? I guess you're looking, or... All right, you'll let me know. If you don't have Simon Hay, then
so we just have the beginning of it, so I'll have to...
You have up to Chavtes, in other words.
Right, so we have the beginning of it, but I'll scan the rest of it and send it out.
Okay, great, excellent. So again, in about 5-10 minutes, we're going to learn a little bit of Rav Soloveitchik's insights into the Torah. Okay, then? Okay, thank you so much.